Hello and welcome to your lesson on reproduction. We're going to start out today actually focusing on specifically asexual reproduction, and then next day we're going to move on to sexual reproduction. Now, the most important thing from this is actually understanding the contrast, the advantages and disadvantages of sexual versus asexual reproduction. And most of the questions and stuff that you look at are actually going to be focusing on that concept because different organisms use different strategies, okay, based on what's better for it. And there's trade-offs for both. So a lot of our discussion today is going to be focused on that sexual versus asexual reproduction. But today it's about asexual reproduction. So learning objective for today is you are learning the pros and cons of both asexual, specifically today asexual, and sexual reproduction, and how asexual reproduction has many different forms. We're not going to learn the different forms in detail. We're just going to kind of like gloss over it and have a very surface discussion of each one. Success criteria. How will you know that you've got this? Well, that you can compare asexual and sexual reproduction using a pros and cons list. We're going to go over that. You can use the diagrams provided to understand how parents have identical or different offspring. You can identify the 4 different forms of asexual reproduction and give examples of each type. And finally, I can identify the process of mitosis. Mitosis and meiosis are really big concepts that we cover again in high school biology, but you're going to have a surface understanding of that after the next couple of days. This one right here of understanding the 4 different forms of asexual reproduction and give examples of each type, that's going to be important. And again, it's going to be very like surface, that you just can list the 4 different forms and kind of know how it works and maybe what kind of species or organism performs that type of reproduction. So that's what we're getting into today. Anyways, reproduction. Spoiler, it doesn't involve storks. So, we kind of already went over this. I guess I have that slide twice. Anyways, reproduction. In terms of definition, some basics around it. Reproduction creates new individuals in a species. That's the whole purpose of reproduction, is to make more of the thing. The way the species reproduces determines how much variability there will be, going to the diversity, right? Genetic diversity and so on, that you've learned about previously. And the individuals can be identical to their parent, and this ties into the other point, or they can be very different, right? So depending on the method we use, that will determine if we have high genetic diversity or not. But at the end of the day, reproduction is always about making more of that particular organism. So, types of reproduction, 2 main types. We're tackling asexual today, but asexual reproduction is where one parent provides genetic material for the offspring and only one parent, as opposed to sexual reproduction, where we have 2 individuals providing genetic material for the offspring, 2 parents. And that's what we call a parent, is basically 2 things that end up having offspring, or 1 thing that has offspring for asexual. So, asexual reproduction. In asexual, the basics are we have 1 parent that produces the 2 offspring. And this arrow is all screwed up. But basically, A produces 2 more A's, with this arrow going more in the right direction between the A's. In asexual reproduction, offspring are identical to the parents. It's a copying process. It's like making a photocopy. You put one in, you press the start button, you get more copies out. And it produces lots of individuals very quickly. Now, we only ever make normally 2 individuals at a time in asexual reproduction, but those 2 individuals can go on to make 2 more individuals, and so on and so on and so on. So we get what's called exponential growth, because 1 turns into 2, and then 2 turns into 4, and 4 turns into 8, and 8 turns to 16, and so on. Each generation, it's doubling. And asexual reproduction is normally a very fast and lower energy process, especially when we look at something like, bacteria, where it ends up duplicating incredibly fast. So you can go from 1 bacteria to millions within like a day, right? Or even a few hours. It's insane. Now, in asexual reproduction, we have no variation unless mutations occur. Everything will be identical unless we get some kind of a mutation change when DNA and stuff copies. And we can get some variation from mutation, but not nearly as much as you'll find out as when you have asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. So you might be thinking, well, like, what's a mutation? Imagine going back to the photocopier example. Yes, I press the start button once I put my copy in, and I end up getting 2 copies being spit out of the photocopier of that one copy I put in. But one has like a visual like artifact or mark on it. Well, there's your mutation, right? Occasionally a mutation might actually make something better, more adapted to survive. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time it just makes it worse. But occasionally that mutation may actually make it somewhat better at reproducing and surviving. And then therefore that would be an adaptation that carries forward. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. This is incredibly important. What are the pros and cons? So first of all, advantages is it is fast. It's time efficient. You don't have to find another mate. Yeah, you don't have to find another parent. It's just boom, you make more offspring. And that means it's also lower energy involved. So it's time efficient, it's fast, and you can make offspring more quickly. It requires a low amount of energy, no searching for a specialized cell, no need to bring cells together. I don't actually like no searching for a specialized cell. I should put no producing a specialized cell. We're going to talk about gametes in the future. No need to bring these cells, these gametes together in order to do that. That'll make more sense in sexual reproduction. But the big thing, low energy. So fast, yes, fast, low energy. Disadvantages. We don't get the same amount of variation. You only get variation if mutations occur. It's all identical, which means if something comes in, a factor like a disease that ends up affecting the population, if they're all identical, they all die, right? If they're susceptible to that disease. So because I don't have as much variation, it's kind of like when we talked about specialists, when we don't have the diversity, if a change occurs, it's just going to cause that population to get wiped out if they are all identical. So variation is good. Okay, so advantage, fast, low energy. Disadvantage, no variation except for mutations, and they're more susceptible to changes because they're all genetically the same. So low diversity. So types of asexual reproduction, we're going to quickly just really fast go over. We have binary fission. That's the main one we think about. We got budding. We have vegetative reproduction, which has a few different types built in there. And then we have spores as well. Okay, and spores is when we talk about things like mold. So binary fission. What this is a cell splits exactly into producing 2 identical individuals from one parent. So what happens is in the cell, it starts replicating everything that normally is inside of the cell. And then after that, it just splits into 2. Okay. So what are some examples of things that do this? Well, single-celled organisms, things like bacteria, algae, amoebas. These are all things that end up actually just going through binary fission. You got 1, so they duplicate everything inside of themselves, and boop, then they split into 2. Okay, the cell duplicates its contents, including its nucleus, which you learned about in Science 8. You're going to learn more about it in Science 10, and all of its organelles. And then that one parent splits into 2 daughter cells that are identical to each other. Okay, so 1 essentially turns into 2. Now, the parent no longer remains. Yes, the parent's gone now. So the one parent turns into the 2 daughter cells. So that's binary fission. Going into budding. Budding's weird. Budding is you actually have like a new organism growing off of the first one. So this is different because in binary fission, it's like an equal splitting. Everything replicates and then it splits into 2. But in budding, it's like instead you grow like this little mini you coming off, right? So imagine you start growing like a little mini baby you on your shoulder, and then it's like, boop, you got a baby there. That would be budding. Okay, so a bud forms, grows, and detaches, providing an identical copy of the parents. So what does this? Well, yeast actually does budding. That's how yeast reproduces. Hydras as well. Okay, same kind of deal. You can actually see the buds coming off of this hydra. There's one, there's the other. Sometimes when budding occurs, you end up having the offspring that actually still stay attached. So all of these things, sea sponges, coral, these are budding type organisms. So I actually have individual organisms here, but they're all kind of attached to the same network. They're all attached to each other, but they are technically separate individuals, which is weird. So sometimes they actually stay attached. So I have large structures composed of many identical individuals. So when I take a look at the sea sponge, every single one of these is genetically identical. And the difference is just the time and the conditions that they've been there. All right, here is a video on budding for you to watch. Okay, let's get into vegetative reproduction, which is basically talking about plants and different ways that plants go through asexual reproduction. Now we're going to learn that plants are actually really neat, that they can do both asexual and sexual, depending on the plant and what they do. But asexual reproduction in plants, it does not involve a seed. It can occur naturally or be induced by humans. So we actually use some of these. So runners is a great example. Runners are stems that grow horizontally above the ground. They have nodes where buds are formed. These buds grow into a new plant. So strawberry plants actually do this by budding. They end up, by runners. They end up sending out runners and then new plants start out. Spider plants are kind of the classic example. Maybe you've seen this, but basically we get these runners coming off of them and then we have like whole new plants coming off of those runners. Maybe you've seen those kind of spider plants before. So strawberries, spider plants, they do this. And the plants they actually make from the runner is genetically identical to the main plant. It's the same, essentially, genetic code. Again, without possible mutations. Bulbs, tubers is another way. Bulbs grow by having buds grow on the side of the main shoot. In a couple of seasons, they have their own roots and foliage. Tubers are swollen, modified roots where new plants will grow out of. Buds develop at the base of the stem and then grow into new plants. Now, you might be thinking right now, too much information. It doesn't matter, okay? What we're really doing here is just saying like, hey, there's different kinds of vegetative reproduction. If you can remember one of these, if you remember runners, you're in great shape. But bulbs and tubers are also fitting into asexual reproduction methods. So some examples of bulb type things. Tulips come out of bulbs. Dahlias, I guess, come out of tubers. And this is actually a picture of a bunch of tubers coming off together. You can see they're all coming off here. And then these are examples of bulbs. Okay, cuttings. Another way that I can perform asexual reproduction for plants. Maybe you've heard of this. You can actually take a piece of a plant, cut it off, put it into water or soil, and it will actually grow new roots and leaves. It will actually start growing from the cutting. So this is a way for people when they have a plant that they think is really, really good to actually reproduce that same identical plant. Just cut a piece off, okay, put it in the ground or in water, and then over time it's actually going to end up growing the roots. It's important that the shoot is cut at an angle, and then you can use some kind of a growth promoter like Miracle-Gro or something in order to get this rolling and for it to get started. Some are better than others at doing this. So ivy is an example of one that's really good for cuttings and works really well. This is a little bit different. I personally don't think this fits very well into vegetative reproduction, but whatever, it's in here. Grafting is where we actually take essentially a piece of a plant, like a branch, and then we attach it to a different plant. So two plants are used to develop a new plant with combined traits from the two parent plants. That's a little bit deceiving. What we do is we take one branch from one plant and we put it into another plant and kind of like cut it in, and then afterwards we end up kind of sealing it up. And then as a result, we end up actually having a branch from a different plant on a plant. So for example, let's say you wanted a plant that had all sorts of different apples. Well, you could take a branch from one apple tree and put it on a different apple tree, okay, by cutting it in, grafting it in, and then from there you actually are going to have two different kinds of apples growing from the one tree. Is this true reproduction? Kind of not, in my opinion, because you're not getting any new individuals from this, right? But it is kind of different and weird and interesting to talk about, and we consider it part of vegetative reproduction. All right, so vegetative reproduction, we had runners, we had cuttings, bulbs and tubers, and then we also had that last one, grafting as well. Finally, the fourth type of asexual reproduction we're going to talk about is spores. Spores is where a single-celled reproductive structure that lives in unfavorable conditions, high temperature, low humidity, usually dormant until conditions improve and they divide. Spores are incredibly hardy and they can last for an incredibly long time. Okay, so organisms, species that use spores, they produce many, many spores. The spores can kind of weather and last for an incredibly long time until they find conditions that are favorable to start growing, and then they'll start growing. Some spores can even like survive crazy temperatures, no moisture, really poor conditions, and they'll still survive. So some examples of things that use spores is things like ferns, moss. Mold is a big one. The spores from mold can actually cause big issues because they can release toxins and stuff. Really nasty. Maybe you've heard of like anthrax. That would be actually spores of anthrax that can actually grow. So similar to seeds, but are produced by non-flowering plants. Their evolutionary strategy is quick reproduction and high reproductive rates that can be found for some plants, molds, algae, and fungi. When I talk about spores, they normally are smaller than seeds, okay, incredibly tiny, especially when I talk about molds. But if I look at these ones from ferns, right, they're actually a little bit larger, but typically they're quite small. So spores, again, important to realize that the offspring they produce are identical to the actual plant that produced the spores. So this is, again, asexual reproduction, where the offspring are identical to the parent. In one species of mushroom fungi, each of the gills underneath the cap produces 13,550 spores on one side of one gill. If a cap has approximately 150 gills, how many spores will it have? And remember that each has two sides. Maybe try, hey, a little bit of math here. Try that out. See if you can find the right answer. Enter it as a big long number. Other things that were examples of things that produce spores: earth star, fungus. Here's fungus actually releasing spores, which is kind of crazy to see. It's shooting it out all at one time when conditions are right, which is kind of neat. Maybe you've seen videos, or we can find a video of all these spores being released at one time. It's crazy. Some of the different strategies used to spread around spores are really quite incredible. All right, here's a video on asexual reproduction. Okay, so when I'm talking about asexual reproduction, I'm talking about cells are being produced by the process of mitosis. Mitosis happens in our body too, but not for reproduction. It's how we make new cells within our body, right? But in mitosis, this is the process of, like in binary fission, where I take one cell and I turn it into two. Now, when I do that, I get two diploid cells. Di means two, okay? And then ploid means basically that I have full genetic code. I don't know what ploid means. I should look that up. Full genetic code for the two offspring. So the two daughter cells I get out of this, I have 46 chromosomes is what this is showing here. And then I end up with 46 chromosomes in the two daughter cells. This is normally what we have in our bodies, is 46 chromosomes in almost all of our cells. Okay, and then basically what would happen is all of the DNA, all the chromosomes would get copied, all the organelles would get copied. I end up getting the two daughter cells being produced by this. Okay, and then I've got my two diploid cells. This is contrasted to meiosis, which we're going to talk about in sexual reproduction. This is probably much better than I am at explaining mitosis, in a little bit more detail than you need to know, but a good video. So here is a video explaining the process of mitosis. Now, when you think of mitosis, I want you to actually say it in your head as mitosis, as in I make two of the thing. Okay, so I get two daughter cells. So mitosis is what you want to think of. All right, well, that's it for today. Have a good rest of your day. I know I already signed off, but I actually want to just add to this a summary of what you learned. So what you learned today is about two types of reproduction. Okay, we're going to get into sexual more. We have asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual has the advantage of the fact that it is fast and it doesn't take much energy. But the big disadvantage is that you do not get variation except for in mutations. So I don't end up having large amounts of genetic diversity resulting from asexual reproduction. You learned about four main types of asexual reproduction. You learned about binary fission. Okay, you learned about budding. You learned about vegetative reproduction. And then finally, you learned about spores. Okay, so you learned about binary fission, budding, vegetative reproduction, and spores. In vegetative reproduction, you learned about cuttings, you learned about runners, you learned about grafting, and you learned about something else. Blanking. Well, now I got to go back. I got to go back to find it because I just can't remember. See? This is, bulbs and tubers. Bulbs and tubers. Okay, so those are your 4 different types. All right. Well, now we're done. Have a good rest of your day.